In the everyday world we live in, a world of chaos, we look out to the distant horizon. We may ask ourselves, what is our true place in the universe? What about the world that lies beyond what you can't see? What is truly there? What has truly decayed away? Everything rusts. Everything decays. What if life had no end? On this voyage, my goal is to show you the world from a different viewpoint.
That's fun, right?
Not everybody in Baltimore is terrible.
I mean, come on.
Baltimore, so far, we've had a pretty good experience.
Pretty good. Everybody's been cool to us.
Damn good, actually, yeah.
Graffiti alley.
Yeah, that graffiti alley is pretty.
Well, I've never had to do this particular calibration. You always has one where you got to pick it up and spin it.
Oh.
So I don't know what to do.
So for everybody out there, we don't know what we're doing.
Did you expect us to?
No, that's what makes it fun. We got the master.
Jedi Master. Actually looks through the light.
It does.
In this story of Shutter Rush, I've come to the city of Baltimore to share the skill sets of 3 photographers, Brook, Jake, and Jason. Photography is what connects us to the world. It's the outlet of calm. It's the adventure to create emotions, laughter, crying, freezing the faded decay to preserve the beautiful surroundings that we take for granted. I've learned something very early in my career, that I have a voice. I can convey my inner voice through capturing the emotions of others. The question is, how do I want to use that voice? I think many photographers really struggle with this. How do they share their voice? This is the very reason Shutter Rush was created, to seek the voice of others and share their viewpoints. So I challenged us 3. We needed to create a masterpiece that no one else has ever done at this very spot at Graffiti Alley. I knew that if we could succeed at Graffiti Alley, we'll inspire others to go create their masterpiece.
Explain to us what you're doing here.
So what we're doing is we're taking this steel wool, and you got an egg beater, just a little harness here with some shoelace. We're tying it down in here. And the idea is we're gonna light this on fire with a lighter. I'm gonna spin it. You guys with the cameras, you're gonna slow it down. We'll have some slow-mo, some spark action.
We're about to do the cart.
The cart scene. Did you get any footage of that cart? Because this cart is going to be epic.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, I researched Instagram. I haven't seen anybody do steel wool. We asked the security guard if he's seen it out here. He's never seen anyone do it. So we were the first to show him. So I'm very confident that we were the first ones out here. If we're not, then, you know, hey, I'll eat my words. But I haven't seen anybody pull this off that we're doing. Pretty stoked. I got the magic kitchen.
All right, so the last one was a whisk. What is this?
This is like a deep fryer like one. So like I don't even know. Like we got it at like one of the box stores, cooking section. I just bought some wire and just wrapped it in there. I got 3 pieces of steel wool, so it should be pretty epic. Oh yeah, I'm feeling it right now. Oh.
What are you gonna do this time as far as spinning it?
I'd say you stand in one spot.
I want these things like coming out at you like this. I want to get angry with this. Pow! Pow! Like I want sparks going everywhere.
All right.
Let me get angry with this.
So I would stand 4 or 5 feet behind the cart then.
How about, can you do this? Where's your flashlight?
You want me to light paint?
No, we'll
Oh, I see. Look. Grab your flashlight.
and then get his up on. How, am I gonna be in the shot right here? Like this?
All right, so they're trying to light up the. There we go. We got some light on the cart.
Yeah.
You want to just hold it? Can you hold it?
Yeah.
All right,
There you go.
Jason.
That'll make it nice. Don't you think?
Actually, I'm gonna move this up a little bit.
Yeah. So it's like your guys' folk.
All right, then Jason, you'd stand right here.
I just want to get
How does that look then? I don't have to hold it. Is that okay?
Let's see.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. That way it gives us some texture.
All right, let's do this. Yeah, it's actually. Eh.
You guys ready?
All right, ready? Tell me.
Light.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, baby, fireworks show. That was good. That was awesome, man. Get that slow mo. Light it up.
Throw him in there, Jake. Throw him in there.
Everybody get this. I'm right here.
Yeah.
In the line.
Y'all want to stay right there?
Come on, bro. You want to get my first one? Want to get in there? What you doing?
Get it, Jake?
Yeah.
You taking care of him?
All of them.
Oh.
All of them 100% bangers. I ain't lying. After we come to the studio, we gotta hit them on the track. Hit them profile.
Jay, you said 100% bangers. I love it.
All right, one more. We're dipping.
All right, so walk us through what's going on with the drone here.
Well, basically getting it all set up, ready to go, just waiting for it to calibrate, and it's going to have me calibrate the compass, which is no big deal.
So this is calibrating to the controller?
It's calibrating the compass in the drone so that when it's flying, it knows where it's at on Earth. All right. It's going to be ready to go in just a second or two.
Uh-oh, I just heard a lot of stuff happen. What just took place?
Basically lined up to do a photo, and I did 5 brackets. Again, so later I can use a luminosity mask or create an HDR image of the entire stadium. And so captured that with ISO 100 at 80th of a second
Okay.
with basically +7 stop. And actually take that again.
So are you going to use any special like photo editing software on this when you look at it later, or no?
Normally I would just use Photoshop, basically like you would for anything else, because these come off in RAW format.
So you're shooting raw right now?
I am shooting RAW, yes.
Okay.
And we've been flying for probably 10 minutes and still have about 16 minutes worth of flying time.
Oh.
It's about 400 feet in the air, and it's about, well, it's on the other side of the stadium, so not too far away.
So it's way over there
Yeah.
on the other side.
And then I'm going to do video and fly end to end over the stadium, because we did crossways going from one
Okay.
stadium to the other. So we'll switch that over and do video.
basic question. Would you take it all and throw it all away? Take me down to the final decision.
You're editing my boys.
Dude, that is awesome. We had the middle finger, everything.
Pretty hard.
Let me see. Oh yeah, that's gangster.
I like the backlighting on that.
Yeah.
That's my new profile pic.
The world will break apart today, and the world will break.
Let's analyze this. We got an adult beverage, another adult beverage, and then we got the root beer float for the kid. Jake, what the? Jake.
Delete all your friends.
Oh my god.
Crisp, that is.
Crisp. Hey, is it as crisp as your root beer float? I just want to know. Wait, Jake, this is your bed. Jake. Oh, you're such an idiot. That's your guys' bed. There's no way that's fitting in there. Oh my god. Jake. Hey Jake, you're gonna have to set that up in the bathroom. Jake's got the kitty bed. Hey, I told you could have snuggled up with me. All right, so what are you gonna do? Give me the game plan.
I'm gonna give up on this show.
No, you're not.
I don't know who the Orioles are.
What?
Is that a hockey team?
Dude, where are you going?
The Harbor. Sons of Sin.
Jake, what's going through your mind right now?
I'm waiting for these clouds to turn pink.
Pink.
Pink, red, orange,
He's predicting pink.
green. I don't know.
I'm thinking purplish.
There's no way.
You calling it a dud? That's your prediction?
Yeah, this is a bad setup.
Starting to die. Let's see. This is all clear. It's getting clearer. 8 minutes until sunset.
8 minutes?
Saturday Night Live intro stuff.
Did it work?
Yeah, it worked. We got 1 minute till we see it. 2 trains, cars going back, people cross, it'll be sweet.
Did you get it?
Very good. Yes, I did. You want to see?
Did you take 36 shots?
No, but I took a couple.
Just a couple? So where should I do it at?
I'm thinking up on this bench.
How are we gonna light the logo? Because we didn't bring no lights. Yeah, but we got to do something different. That's what we got to do.
Hey,
we got to be creative.
I got an idea.
Like, this is where we are 3 creative minds.
All right, hey,
I got the flashlight.
stay
We can light
tuned.
paint.
No. Open the car door. Stay tuned.
What's this epic thing you got?
Here we go.
Yeah, what's the idea, Jake?
Come on, Jake.
Remember there was like unlock the thing and I was
Jake, we're in Baltimore at the Under Armour headquarters. We have to do something epic. What are you going to pull out of this bag that's gonna set us apart from anybody out there?
It's like the Harry Potter bag of holding.
Like, I'm not seeing anything come out.
Hold on. All right.
Oh, he just showed us.
33% brightness. Here we go.
Oh,
100. Look at that thing. Woo.
now we're talking. Doing it this way?
Right,
Okay, so that way the sparks are going.
right.
Okay. Okay. You all let me know when you're ready. All right, Jake. So here we are. We're at the Under Armour headquarters. We got the steel wool. We're trying something that we never did before. Hopefully I don't catch their field on fire and I don't catch this deck on fire. If so, you guys grab your stuff and we'll run into the car. So here we go, Under Armour. Hope you like it. Okay. Sorry. It's not. It keeps blowing out.
Let it sit a little bit.
It is. It keeps blowing. It keeps going out. Dude. Alright, take 2. Whoa. Why is it burning out like that?
He's ready when you are. I'm back. Oh wait, my light's not on. Hold on.
Please tell me you're recording that.
Yeah. All right. I wouldn't say that too loud. You're waiting for it to burn out.
But it should.
Gary, give me it. Switch rolls. Switch rolls.
Hold on, no. Dude, what? Jake. I have this one. Like, this, it's the same that I was using. Like, I was using this packet. So what packet is
No,
this?
that's gold. You have to use the gold shit. That's why. Damn it, I should have brought my steel wool. You
Hold
didn't-
on, I got more down in here.
Yeah, the gold.
Oh!
There's a
We're in
specific
business.
kind.
All right,
Can't believe no one taught you this.
listen. All right,
Okay.
thank you. Stupid piece of crap, steel wool. But throw that in the harbor. Now we're talking. I told you.
See,
you
isn't it
needed,
different?
We
That's
needed the
thin.
gold. It's different texture.
You
This kid didn't listen to me.
Let me
look.
take
That's a
care of
lot
the lid.
thick.
Yeah, I'll pick it up.
Okay.
I'll pick it up. This guy is a good guy. He thought I was gonna pick it up.
Put it in the trash can.
Take. What are we on? Take 99.
Everything's probably gonna burn out. The lights have been sitting
Oh,
on.
that thing probably stopped filming. Ah, dang, that was hot.
All right, let me look at this. Hold on.
Hold on.
You gotta get you in position again.
Take 99. We got a drone.
Look, there's a freaking helicopter with a spotlight on.
Oh, you guys are in trouble.
I guess you got it turned on.
Oh,
Do you see that?
you all in trouble.
Look over here.
Yeah, you guys are all in trouble.
Dude, that's kind of scary.
Jake did it. He's got the fire, not me.
Bro, look at the light.
Oh, you're in trouble.
They're looking for something.
Yeah, they're looking for the guy that was just spinning the steel wool.
Probably.
No, sir. Keep walking. 50 Cent. Do I look like I'm 50 Cent?
What do you say?
Cut spare 50 Cent. See, that's what you gotta do. They'll pester you.
You got that thing recorded?
Yeah, you dope. I gotta record when I said keep walking.
We gotta do an intro, like, alright, we're walking.
Who's this guy? Steven, fresh out of film school, Spielberg? This guy. He's giving me the mean mug. Well, let's get you into some tailgating over there and get you trying to get some free food. What do you think? I want you to ask, your goal is to ask for a free hot dog.
Where?
Anywhere through here, just ask somebody for a free hot dog. Yes, free hot dog. Free hot dog.
Anyone got a free hot dog?
Ooh. You want your picture with the rat bird? You want your picture with the rat bird? All right.
No, but it's cool.
Just asking. Coming through. Go get your picture with that rat bird right there.
Is there another one?
Right there, the rat bird.
Let's do it.
Come on. Do you not know how to use an iPhone? What the heck? What, this guy's an amateur we brought with us. What an amateur. Ask. Go through that. Just go through. Ask him.
Hi guys, media will. Okay, that's gonna be around the corner, around like 18. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
That guy lied to him. He's also getting A1 to let you in, I think.
Well, we got to pick up his media pass, so that's where we got to pick his up at. That way? Okay. Thank you, sir. Will they have the media vest at this one, or is that over there?
They should have them down there for you. That's our media entrance.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, sir.
Let's go, man.
This is the shittiest weather. Guys, I ain't going out on the field. I'm telling you that right now. I'm staying in the media room. Have fun. It's good, because I ain't going out. I'll go out for the handshake. Dude, this sucks. Yeah, time for a Nanook. Nanook, can you please help my brother out here? Brother Brook has this, I don't even know, it's called a tenba. A tenba. What is a tenba? This is a tenba. It's not even a real case. This is a real case, the Nanook. What are you trying to do with this setup right here? Walk us through. Tell us what you got.
Lights, players coming out. Right when they stand in front of the purple light, you want to get their portrait. Nice little.
Here we go. Here you go. Get this guy. Let me see you get this guy. Let's see what you got. I don't know. What do you think about this spot we're at?
I think we're gonna be cool.
Yeah.
Fans don't want to be here. It's in the rain. We're elevated. We get some light. It's gonna be great.
I'm sitting at the Mary Jo. Just so you in trouble. You love Mary Jo?
I love Mary Jo too. No, I'm Sandy, but I still love Mary Jo. Get that on recording.
Oh, it's on there.
Mary Jo.
I love Mary Jo. That's my wife. I was in the end zone down here taking a picture.
Yeah.
With this one. I had this one lean up against me. Someone bumped me and fell over and knocked. Broke.
You broke your whole thing?
Well, it's
The coupling?
yeah.
Oh man, let's document this.
You can see it's pulled away.
Oh no.
So when you go to focus now, it focuses and goes blurry. It won't lock in until
You know what this means, right?
new camera, new lens.
Mirrorless, baby. Oh, that sucks. So this is what happens on the sideline. Your cameras get jacked and then you end up breaking them. Oh, golly.
It's all right. I'll switch camera lens situation here in a little bit.
Okay.
And we'll put the good camera on this lens and we'll be good.
You'll be fine. Okay.
Cold and wet. I want to go home.
Steelers underperformed.
Yes.
And they did everything. Interception, fumble, safety.
Yeah.
You botch punt. What else did they do wrong? They did it wrong, and therefore, game over.
So while we got a few minutes to wrap on the weekend, tell me your thoughts on Jake when he had to sleep on the rollaway bed.
I was waiting for him to complain about the springs poking him in the balls, but he didn't. And so it turned out okay. Maybe it's because he's young. I don't know. He didn't complain. Even if it was set up in the hallway, it was good.
He was a trooper, though, right?
Yeah.
He was a trooper.
And being like, the 20-year-old, he fell asleep within like 5 minutes of laying down.
That's a wrap. Don't film me with that crappy Nikon. Okay? Don't film me with that Nikon.
So you don't want him to film you with that $3,000 Nikon, but the $350 DJI.
That's right. 350, baby, right here. How to do this. You get that on there? Oh, that's yours. I need your opinion on how to set that up.
Hurt my balls.
Oh, Jake, what happened? Oh, wait, Jake, what happened? What happened? What happened with your wallet? Half of my wallet fell in the piss. Oh, Jake, you dropped your wallet in the pisser? Oh my God, Jake. I can't believe this.
I'm getting a new wallet tomorrow, that's for certain.
Oh, Jake, did it like fully submerge?
No, it was like the side of it. Luckily, I saw it and grabbed it. I thought my sock fell. I was gonna flush it, but I look into my wallet.